know if you want to, but without further ado, welcome Valerie.
Great. Hello, all. And I'll share my screen. I have some slides just because I'm a visual person.
That's great.
And wanted to sort of, before I jump into slide mode, also acknowledge that I am originally from Corvallis, Oregon, and I imagine many of you have interacted with my mother, Valerie Cleland, who has been an active Zontian for a very long time. So love seeing some Corvallis full, as well as the sort of greater Pacific Northwest and beyond crew. And so let me just get this launched and we will be good to go. So 1 second. Bear with me here. Okay.
Great.
Oh, and it is not showing the right thing.
That's all right.
Give me 1 second. Well, while I am figuring this out, my first slide just says who I am. I'm Valerie. I'm at NRDC. I now work predominantly in the federal policy world, but my background and training was as a marine scientist. And so today I wanted to sort of broadly touch on sort of climate, ocean stuff, which is my passion, and then sort of connection to women and bring some of it to Zonta. And it sounds like many of you will already be very familiar with some of the climate stuff, which is great. So let me try this one more time. All right, can folks see my screen?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay, so I actually was hoping to start out with, before we dive into things, if people would be willing to share a brief sort of favorite experience at the beach or the ocean, an early memory, or anything in between. I can give a first example. I said from Oregon originally. And I remember in elementary school finding an octopus in a tide pool and being just totally blown away at this like incredible creature. And it started a lifelong love affair with the ocean. Anyone else just go off mute and share something?
I'm happy to share not only that I love the ocean, whether it's the Atlantic or the Pacific, but I think the thing that I remember most was in the early 2000s being in Thule on the west coast of Greenland and seeing within one day the whole bay brown with runoff from under the glacier during the worst, first worst rain event in that area, according to the Danish Danish Institute for Greenland. It was frightening to see what had happened. And by the way, for you Americans, the river from the glacier that connected the base with the landing strip was inaccessible because the bridges had been all washed away. That for me was the first time that I saw what global warming and the ocean and the Arctic are facing.
Thank you. Wayne?
Well, when I was a child, I'm born and raised in Olympia area here. So family went to the ocean beaches just 2 hours away. And I remember just loving to swim in the ocean and being, 4, 5, 6 years old. That just felt warm to me at that point. I don't understand that going back in that now, but we do spend, my wife and I, and we have 3 kids, that we have grandkids now, 5 grandkids, but love to go to the ocean. So that's our summer, at least 1 week or so, try to get to the ocean beaches of Oregon or Washington coast. And then being Navy for 30 years, that was sort of my goal, is to visit a bunch of beaches. So, and had lots of nice sights, a couple bad ones, but some good memories.
Anyone else?
I just associate going to the ocean with relaxation, soothing, calm, vacation, and fun.
Great. Well, thank you for being willing to share. You know, I think even if we don't live near the coast, going to the beach with family or friends or on travel, whether it's, you know, positive or sort of firsthand experiencing that climate change, but going to the coast and the beach is almost a universal experience for most of us, and I think connects us in more ways than we realize. And so with that, I'm going to dive in, and I might be brief on this part if a lot of it is an overview for many of you. So the ocean supports us in so many ways. It feeds us, produces half of the oxygen that we breathe. It's a source of jobs and recreation. The wetlands and reefs protect coastal businesses and homes from storms and is a source of wonder. As noted on this slide here, you know, the ocean covers 70% of Earth's surface and has already absorbed more than 90% of the heat of climate change and a third of carbon emissions, which is pretty astounding. And in that same breath, the ocean also has the potential to provide a fifth of the cuts needed to greenhouse gas emissions to reduce global temperature rise, which is my way of saying the ocean is an incredible source of climate solutions because it has the power to both mitigate climate change and enhance the resilience of marine ecosystems and the coastal communities that rely on. And wanted to say sort of right off the bat here that while virtually every community and every corner of the world is affected by climate change, we know that not all are affected equally. And we know that low-income communities and communities of color will bear the largest burden of climate change impacts, including the coastal communities that are already facing, you know, sea level rise, harmful algal blooms, and other pieces. I've got one slide on this, and I will try and keep it short. So the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, it's a group made up of thousands of unpaid scientists, volunteers from around the world, sort of put out the most critically important climate report that we have. And this past September, they updated their latest climate report. And in recent years, you know, the reports have continued to sound the alarm with increasing clarity that we have to cut our emissions sharply to avoid the most catastrophic effects of warming planet. And sort of the key here in both that this is, you know, the words they used in the report were widespread, rapid, and intensifying. But also it is still possible to hold global warming to relatively safe levels. But doing so is going to require global cooperation, billions of dollars, and big changes. My favorite quote from the report was "We are walking when we should be sprinting," which I think sort of sums up where we are right now. The report, for those not familiar, looks at different scenarios focused on the goal of limiting warming to that 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the number that was laid out in the 2015 Paris Agreement. And limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius rather than 2 degrees, say, makes a really big difference. So the difference between 1.5 of warming and 2 degrees might mean the difference of tens of millions more people experiencing, you know, the heat waves, water shortages, wildfires, coastal flooding. And that 1.5 degree world will still have coral reefs and some summer Arctic ice, whereas in that 2 degree scenario, we probably won't. And as we currently stand under the policies of governments around the world, we are on pace to heat up by 2.1 to 2.9 degrees by the end of the century. So kind of scary. And, you know, it sort of makes clear that the actions that we take today have the potential to fundamentally reshape the planet for thousands of years. And so it's clear that, you know, whatever future we end up with is still within our control. And so using that as like big framework, I'm going to step back into the ocean world, which is what I know best. So very briefly on sea level rise. Sea levels are expected to rise as much as 1 foot by 2050, and about 40% of the US population lives along the coast. You know, I don't think anyone here needs me to tell them that that's pretty scary and has huge implications, especially for large coastal cities. Another thing we always talk about when we think about the ocean and climate impacts is ocean acidification. Our seawater can only absorb so much carbon dioxide until it becomes corrosive to some shell-bearing organisms like oysters. And living in corrosive waters is just as dangerous as it sounds for many marine species. And so ocean acidification makes it more difficult for organisms, from oysters to crabs to mussels to plankton, coral, to build the strong shells and skeletons that they need to survive. So for example, you know, in the Pacific Northwest for, gosh, I think it's been more than a decade now, oyster farmers in Washington and Oregon have been struggling with the corrosive waters killing off the youngest oyster larvae, and have had to change how they grow oysters as conditions continue to get worse. And so I know a lot of folks in Washington state are actually raising the baby oysters out in Hawaii, and then when they're a little stronger and bigger, then bringing them back to Washington. And just to like throw some numbers out there, in the Pacific Northwest, the shellfish industry is estimated to be worth somewhere around like 270 million. And so, you know, the shellfish that are vulnerable to this ocean acidification in the Northwest, that would impact like 60% of the fishery revenue for the region. So like pretty big economic consequences in terms of food. To speak very briefly on impacts to women, the quote, one of the quotes on the slide says, "The climate crisis is not gender neutral," which is not a surprise, I think, to anyone on this call. So I won't belabor it, but you know, the United Nations estimates that 80% of people displaced by climate change are women. And it's not just storms. Researchers in India found that droughts hit women the hardest, and women are more vulnerable than men to income loss, food insecurity, water scarcity, and other complications that come from impacts of climate change. And in many of these regions, women bear the disproportionate responsibility for securing food and water and fuel. And climate change is really what we think of as a threat multiplier. So it escalates those pre-existing social, political, and economic tensions all across the world. And so all of these factors and many more mean that as climate change intensifies and as our oceans and coastal communities see the impacts, women will struggle the most. I know that Paris Climate Agreement I mentioned earlier has specific provisions to ensure that women receive additional support to cope with hazards of climate change, because it is so well researched that this is a phenomenon that we face. So to move things on to a little bit more hopeful, you know, the climate crisis has one of the most challenging things humanity has grappled with. And I don't think it's something that we solve just with our, you know, brains alone. We have to come to it as whole humans. And that means the grief and the uncertainty and the rage and the anxiety, but also our like deep love and wonder of the world. And it's been shown time and time again, as many of you know, that women's leadership and equal participation results in better outcomes for climate policy, reducing emissions, and protecting lands and oceans. And indeed, what I've seen in this work is that some of our most influential climate leaders are women. So on the international stage, the former head of the UN Framework on the Convention on Climate Change was a woman who wrote that historic 2015 Paris Agreement that had that call out to empower women in climate decision making. Celebrities like Jane Fonda have continued to bring attention to the issue through civil disobedience and her fire drill Fridays. I don't know if anyone remembers those. They're amazing. And then the activism of youth, like the Swedish teenager Greta Thunberg. And then folks in government too. I think of, New Zealand's prime minister, as well as people in our own country, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who helped write the Green New Deal to figure out how we can transition from fossil fuels towards that clean energy future. And I'll say in the ocean space, a name I'd look out for is Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, who has done incredible work inserting oceans into the climate conversation and public discourse, and has shaped some of the climate policy in the Biden administration, and is a ocean climate visionary. And so when I think about, again, coming back to the ocean piece, ocean climate action, John Kerry said that you can't solve the climate crisis without the ocean, and that you can't solve the ocean crisis without reducing emissions. And so holding global warming to that magic, 1.5 degrees would require nations to reduce their emissions by roughly, I think last I saw it was more than 40% by 2030. And I think about the things in the ocean that are bringing me hope in the face of these crises. So I'll briefly touch on them. So the first is offshore energy. So offshore wind is critical in transitioning away from fossil fuels. Because ocean life is struggling to adapt to climate change, launching a new offshore wind industry in a smart way that protects our valuable and vulnerable ocean life, I think is absolutely critical to the future. And a big piece of that is ending the new offshore oil and gas thing. I think many of us remember sort of the impact, whether it was the Exxon Valdez oil spill or the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster, but offshore drilling, not only contributes to the climate crisis, but has real impacts on marine ecosystems and coastal communities. And so when I think about sort of who's leading the fight in moving us from offshore drilling to things like offshore wind, I think of groups in the Gulf of Mexico, like Taproot Earth, which is a local group led by one of the most impressive women I've ever known, sort of asking for the future that we not only need, but deserve. Another hope point for me is blue carbon, which is just the term for describing carbon that's captured by our world's ocean and coastal ecosystem. So think of eelgrass and mangroves and tidal marshes that take in remarkable amounts of carbon. And it's sort of this incredible thing where if we protect our coastal ecosystems, they'll absorb more carbon and also buffer us from the worst of storms and create healthy environments. It's sort of a win-win-win all around. So I think that's a really incredible piece. I also see a lot of room for hope in biodiversity. At NRDC, we always talk about the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis as sort of twin crises that we're facing. And so, our planet's home to some 8 million species of plants and animals. And protecting this diversity of life on our planet is more than just about the scientific discovery, because biodiversity is the primary indicator for our planet's health and underpins every facet of our society, from food to medicine to culture to our ability to withstand extreme weather. It's our biodiversity is so critical, and thriving biodiversity is needed for a healthy ecosystem. And nature is so incredibly resilient. We've seen time and time again, if we can protect it and give it a chance, it can recover. And so on this slide here, there's a science-based goal to protect at least 30% of our lands, waters, and ocean areas by 2030. And that means everything from endangered species, like on this slide, these are North Atlantic right whales that are off of the East Coast, but protecting our species often leads to protecting habitat and growing awareness about our natural environment. And speaking of protecting biodiversity, we don't need to watch the whole thing, but I'm going to see if this works to share a few clips of this video. The quick preface is the news broke, gosh, I want to say just a couple of weeks ago, that off the coast of mostly it's like Georgia and South Carolina, we discovered that we have what we think is the world's largest deep sea coral habitat that scientists have only sort of recently discovered and mapped. And it is amazing. So I'm gonna see if I can just play a little bit of this, because me describing it to you does not explain how cool it is. Let me know if you can hear it. So let's see if this works.
No, I think you'd have to click on,
Can't hear it?
yeah,
Let's see.
there's a way to do audio, but you might have had to have done it when you switched into sharing the screen. I'm not sure.
Hear sound. Let's try one more time, otherwise.
There you go.
Given the proximity of so many millions of people that live along the southeast coast, it seems that, of course, this area would be very well known and we would know exactly where everything is, and that's so not true.
Pilot, are you ready to continue descent?
Pilot's ready.
We are out on the Blake Plateau off the coast of the southeast United States, ranging essentially from Cape Hatteras all the way down to the Bahama Banks off the coast of Florida.
Previously to the Okeanos coming out here and mapping more of this flat part of the Blake Plateau, this was all kind of originally just thought to be soft sediment. But these mound features really do shed light on how prolific these cold water coral communities are. One thing I think we can talk about a little bit is how the live coral is actually white in this type of environment. So these are actually live and healthy. I'm not speechless, obviously, because I keep talking, but this is, for me, really, really exciting.
The Million Mounds region is what we think is the largest continuous deep sea coral ecosystem discovered thus far on Earth. We're talking about an area about 7 million acres.
There's been very little exploration work out here. That I think we're the first deep submergence vehicles that have actually been able to dive on this amazing feature. So it's really exciting to be out here today.
These mounds are made through hundreds of thousands of years of coral growing. They have cored down to the bottom of one of these, and at the base of it, in the core, it was over 1 million years old.
What we see when we look at the Gulf Stream, there's a very tight correlation where you see the most dense coral mounds and the healthiest mounds, and where the Gulf Stream is strongest. The coral mounds influence the biodiversity of the seafloor by basically providing habitat structure. So a lot of things in the deep sea that we observe, they don't always have a place to settle in soft sediment that's moving around. They like to attach to something hard. So those coral mounds provide a great habitat upon which other things can grow, and that's where we tend to see a lot of the biology that we're interested in.
Right, I'll save us from the last couple minutes, but it sort of speaks to one of my favorite things about working in the ocean space is we are constantly discovering these new incredible places. And scientists think that the Blake Plateau might be an incredible area for climate resilience because it is so deep and cold and the habitat is so healthy. It really speaks to if we can, you know, protect incredible areas like this, it provides real hope. It's a pretty incredible thing. And all this to say, you know, I think many in the climate space sort of forget that the ocean is an incredible source of solutions. And many of the steps needed to take action, both to protect our ocean and take action on climate change, are already happening, just not quite at the speed or scale that's needed. I think the biggest challenge is whether there's that, political will to change, particularly here in the U.S., where we're the second largest carbon polluter after China, and still far and away the largest polluter in history. And so when I think about the ocean and climate change, what I really think of, rather than the, deeply depressing statistics, I think about ending offshore drilling, investing in renewables, creating marine protected areas, lifting up the voices of coastal communities and the people that lead them, especially women, in this movement. And again, I think the ocean is highly resilient. We just need to give it a chance. And so I can't help myself. I always include a what can you do? And some of this might be very repetitive, but I'm going to say it anyways, because sometimes I need to hear this myself too. I think one of the single biggest things we can do to make an impact, both for the ocean and for the climate, is to talk to our friends and family and our representatives. That means everything from encouraging your members of Congress to enact new laws to limit carbon emissions, because the reason our elected officials do anything difficult is because their constituents, us, make them. And I can say from personal experience working for one of our dear senators from Washington State, when I was working in Congress, even 10 calls from constituents on one issue makes a difference. And it's something that people take a note of and are like, oh, we're getting pressure. And so, our elected officials are accountable to us. I also add in don't try to do everything, do what you can. The fossil fuel industry would love us to think that it's all of our individual choices that are the problem. This is very untrue. While our personal choices certainly make a difference, whether it's biking or eating less meat or using renewable energy, it's these large corporations that are ultimately responsible. So rather than beating ourselves up when we fall short of environmental perfection, we can choose meaningful actions that work for us. Vote. This seems very clear and obvious, but especially in local elections, for people that are going to act on climate and do the hard work sort of throughout every level of government. And I have seek joy and allow for grief. I think a lot of us tend to feel a little hopeless about climate change, and that's super normal. I know many of us that work in climate science or activism, we feel that sorrow and despair and grief, which makes that seeking joy even more important, whether it's, a trip to the beach or a walk in the park and sort of reminders of what it is that we're fighting for. And I've got more thoughts on how to figure out what's right for you to do, but I think there's many avenues there. And with that, I will leave it to questions and I can stop sharing my screen.
Great, that was absolutely wonderful. So if you've got a question, please raise your hand, speak up.
I do. I can't get my hand gesture to raise, so I'm going to speak up. Anyway, thank you. That was amazing. I have a question too, actually. So the Blake Plateau, right? So is it better to discover these because it'll allow protection? Or does it open it up for, anyway, answer that for me first.
I think it's great news to discover it, because the Blake Plateau, the reason we first learned about it is when people were looking for critical minerals. It is a very large manganese deposit. And so there's sort of a potential future threat of, say, deep sea mining to go after some of those critical minerals. And so now that we know this incredible habitat is there. I heard a scientist describe it to me as like coral neighborhoods. It was so neat. But now that we know that's there, it gives us an ability to sort of say no to destructive things like deep sea mining, or, you know, some fishing practices like bottom trawling that like scrape along the seafloor can work to keep that out of this area.
Good, good. Okay, well, that was my question, because I know they are, like you said, they are doing a lot of that deep sea mining. Okay, my second question, and then that's it, is so the starfish that we have lost here in Washington State, is that from the acidification?
That's a great question. I think that is from disease.
But so have we gone through this before, or is it, because I didn't think they were sure exactly if it was a waste disease or if it was from.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not totally sure. My recollection says it was a disease that I think is fueled by warmer waters and growth of whatever the pathogen is.
All right. Yeah,
I'm not totally sure.
Hope to see them come back, but yeah. All right, thank you. That was a really good presentation, by the way. Thank you.
So Wayne.
Hi, and thanks, Valerie, for, can you hear me? I have a headphone on here now. Great presentation, thank you. This may be a little bit out of your ballpark from what you said, but I'm wondering if, well, some of the things if, in terms of NRDC, what your organization now is thinking in terms of energy and electricity generation, and as we're headed toward as fast as we can to electrification without burning carbon fuels. The problem that we have with wind generation, particularly in the oceans, in terms of setting up where the winds are the best in terms of, or most reliable. But what does NRDC feel or advocate in terms of breaking the log jam? It seems like that of the ways of generating electricity, that the wind generation or wind generation over the oceans is the slowest growing of all of the 5 different ways of generating. Do you see any way of breaking that impasse that we have, or we seem to be, particularly in the U.S.?
You are spot on. It's, I think, both a real opportunity and a real challenge. And a lot of the challenge comes with some of the laws that have been in place in the US for a very long time, which are extraordinarily difficult to change. And so trying, the options are sort of either, work as best we can within our current system, which we are absolutely doing. And then it's like at the same time, especially given the current state of Congress, sort of what can be done. I know some of the investments from the Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA, for renewable energy were absolutely huge. But offshore wind sort of faces some unique challenges. I could talk about this for a whole nother day, but there's like Jones Act challenges about sort of can foreign vessels, and there's only like a certain number of US vessels available, so we need to invest in our own shipbuild. There's huge potential if we invest in it.
Do you see that we're going to be able to break that impasse, though, in terms of talking about 3 or 4 years or 5 years or 10 years by the time IRA is going to be finished, essentially, is that 10-year program?
Good question.
If the funds are going to be available at that point. Well, certainly we don't even know if the funds will be available next year. What does NRDC feel about in terms of what's going to be happening in the next few years in terms of the IRA use of the IRA?
Hopefully that funding, the administration has been working really hard to get that money out the door so that it can't sort of all be stripped away. So there's been sort of huge federal efforts underway to move those funds out. A lot of it is, well, a lot of it is in areas that I don't personally work in. As the like ocean portfolio is smaller, but I think, you know, one of the biggest challenges that NRDC is thinking about with offshore wind and that logjam is, you know, it really depends on where we're looking to develop that offshore wind, because, you know, dare I call out Oregon. Oregon is not super thrilled about the development of offshore wind. And so it's how do we, you know, A, connect with those communities, and B, find a way. We try and use the words like responsible offshore wind development, because, you know, the mass industrialization of our ocean, I'll say as myself, scares the living, you know, bejesus out of me. But if we do it in a responsible way that respects wildlife and sort of works with other ocean industries, which we totally think is possible, but I think the political opposition in some places is really, really high. And so sort of how do you change the hearts and minds of the people that live there?
Hmm.
And if I figured that out, I don't know, I'd make a real.
Claudia, and then Pete, and then Paula. So Claudia.
Unmoved. Two questions. How much is Alaska playing into the considerations of the oceans in the institution you work for? Because Alaska, the coast of Alaska, is more threatened by climate change than any other part, except maybe from the Gulf of Mexico, and women are tremendously impacted by it in the Alaska communities. The other thing is that with the loss of the sea ice cover in the Arctic Ocean, there is not only the question of the impact on women, there is also the strategic question, because the Arctic coast of the United States and Canada will be accessible to bad actors very soon. And on the other hand, the transport that will happen more and more might lead to tremendous dangers of pollution. And who can clean up if there is pollution up there? These are the things that I'm being now in Canada. I'm thinking to some extent is a bit overlooked, especially here in Canada.
I couldn't agree more with everything that you just said. And at NRDC, we think a lot about Alaska. I know on my team in particular, we were really worried there was a new offshore oil and gas lease sale a little more than a year ago in Cook Inlet, Alaska, and NRDC sued. And so we are trying sort of to throw most of my organization is lawyers. So we're trying to throw sort of every legal wrench we can to try and protect Alaska's coast. One of the slides I actually deleted because I thought my presentation got too long, was about Alaska and coastal community relocation and sort of the incredible need and burden on communities, especially in Alaska, that are already having to fully move because of the impacts of climate change. And, you know, I think it's something we think about and worry about a lot, especially since the elected officials in Alaska are not, have not historically been great allies on this. And it's not directly ocean, but the Pebble Mine fight was something we were very involved in, which was they were proposing to put a giant gold and copper mine at the headwaters of the most productive salmon run in the world. Oh, Claudia, if you're talking, you're on mute. Still on mute. Maybe she'll come back.
Yeah, maybe she will. So Pete, why don't you go ahead with your question?
Yeah, so actually your the comment about the or the fact about the impact of the shellfish, I think you said it was like 275 million, and I think that, or I wonder if you know the answer to this, but it seems to me that given the tremendous impact that that Claudia talked about with Alaska, but also, this recent huge decline in the availability of king crab,
Yeah.
and as a really big warning sign, and the amount, in particular in the Puget Sound area, the amount of dollars and the economy that's dedicated to supporting a lot of those activities in Alaska probably dwarfs, our Pacific Northwest industry thing. I mean, the shipbuilding that happens, the processing, all of the barges that go there with, millions and millions of dollars a month in things. So, it'll have a lot more impact, I guess, as so much of the climate change things. It's not just what's right in your backyard, but what's in other people's backyards as well.
And there have been, we've heard stories from fishermen in Alaska who have been spotting tropical fish up near, up in Alaska, which is, previously unheard of. The changes in our ocean are absolutely wild. Oh, Claudia, I see that you're back. And, unmute.
There you go.
A frightening fact that I learned about the circumpolar situation. The Soviets started raising Pacific salmon on the Kola Peninsula many decades ago. Because of the change in the Arctic Ocean, they have now caught Pacific salmon in Iceland, off the coast of Iceland. They escaped and they are spreading. We know that we have found Pacific salmon in the Mackenzie Delta already. So the whole ecosystem is changing. But I must confess, when my son told me that who is Icelandic, when I heard that they had found a coho in Icelandic waters, I was more than shocked. Because it shows how things are changing. And the one thing that I'm missing in all the debates about ocean warming is the input of fresh water in the Arctic Ocean, which changes the whole of, especially not so much here, but the Atlantic, North Atlantic circulation. I always forget the proper name, because that will affect the Gulf Stream, that will affect the northernmost of the United States and our Canadian East Coast, and it's frightening.
It is. It's very frightening. I know there's been news stories about the changes in our transatlantic currents.
Yeah.
I'll say the news has exaggerated a little bit, but it's still very scary.
Well, I mean, the scientists predicted that to happen 50 years ago.
They did.
That's what is so horrible, to my mind. It was known.
We're getting a little close to the end of time. Any other final questions or comments for Valerie?
Didn't Paula have her hand up? I think.
Oh, yeah, she did. Where are you, Paula?
Right next to you on my screen. So my only comment, I don't know the reason behind it, but maybe you would, that there's two proposed wind generating, whatever it's called, off the coast of Oregon, the wind turbines for energy. And in our own local area, two of the biggest opponents to that proposal are our tribes, our two tribes. And I'm not sure, we certainly want to honor their positions, but I'm not exactly sure why they are so opposed to the wind turbines. And you probably don't have a clue either, but I thought I'd throw it out just in case.
I confess I do not know. But I can't say there's been sort of enormous amounts of misinformation about offshore wind and sort of who it impacts and where it is and what it does. So I think my mind step one is, let's talk and listen and hear what those concerns and thoughts are. And I always try and connect it to the, I know some on the East Coast, at least, there's a lot of the not in my backyard mentality. And reminding folks that most offshore wind is very offshore. It is really far out there, and a few turbines is nothing in comparison to not acting on climate.
Really quick, Paula, I'm working on some other issues here in my county, and the tribes, there's three tribes, and one of them is very conservative, and so they're no different sometimes in our own governments, and sometimes some are a little more conservative. So that could be what you're up against.
Thank you.
Great. Well, I really, really appreciate you being with us tonight, Valerie. I think it's just wonderful to hear from people who are actually doing the work in the field. And you're one of those folks in the ocean. So yes, big round of applause for joining us. Appreciate it very, very much.